What up, y'all? I'm about to go record part 2 of the Transformation of Doña Soledad because although I am well versed in the art of blah blah, conversations for hours, not so well versed and trained on just speaking nonstop for 30 plus minutes. So perhaps with more repetitions we'll get there, and these chapters are quite lengthy. But before we get into the Transformation of Doña Soledad, part 1, just want to say this video or this excerpt is being brought to you from gratitude, love, appreciation, big ups, high quality energy, and many blessings to the Silver Spirit YouTube channel. Please go check him out. He's dropping bombs, and honestly, he was really a cherry on top to me even exploring this. There's a lot more that can be said, but right now, much love to Silver Spirit. Keep doing you. Thank you for the inspiration, and let's get into it. Shall we continue? 1. The Transformation of Doña Soledad. I had a sudden premonition that Pablito and Nestor were not home. My certainty was so profound that I stopped my car. I was at the place where the asphalt came to an abrupt end, and I wanted to reconsider whether or not to continue that day the long and difficult drive on the steep, coarse gravel road to their hometown in the mountains of central Mexico. I rolled down the window of my car. It was rather windy and cold. I got out to stretch my legs. The tension of driving for hours had stiffened my back and neck. I walked to the edge of the paved road. The ground was wet from an early shower. Rain was still falling heavily on the slopes of the mountains to the south, a short distance from where I was. But right in front of me, toward the east and also toward the north, the sky was clear. At certain points on the winding road, I had been able to see the bluish peaks of the Sierras shining in the sunlight a great distance away. After a moment's deliberation, I decided to turn back and go to the city because I had had a most peculiar feeling that I was going to find Don Juan in the market. After all, I had always done just that, found him in the marketplace since the beginning of my association with him. As a rule, if I did not find him in Sonora, I would drive to central Mexico and go to the market of that particular city, and sooner or later Don Juan would show up. The longest I had ever waited for him was 2 days. I was so habituated to meeting him in that manner that I had the most absolute certainty that I would find him again, as always. I waited in the market all afternoon. I walked up and down the aisles pretending to be looking for something to buy. Then I waited around the park. At dusk, I knew that he was not coming. I had then the clear sensation that he had been there but had left. I sat down on a park bench where I used to sit with him and try to analyze my feelings. Upon arriving in the city, I was elated with the sure knowledge that Don Juan was there in the streets. What I felt was more than the memory of having found him there countless times before. My body knew that he was looking for me. But then, as I sat on the bench, I had another kind of strange certainty. I knew that he was not there anymore. He had left, and I had missed him. After a while, I discarded my speculations. I thought that I was beginning to be affected by the place. I was starting to get irrational. That had always happened to me in the past after a few days in that area. I went to my hotel room to rest for a few hours, and then I went out again to roam the streets. I did not have the same expectation of finding Don Juan that I had in the afternoon. I gave up. I went back to my hotel in order to get a good night's sleep. Before I headed for the mountains in the morning, I drove up and down the main streets in my car, but somehow I knew that I was wasting my time. Don Juan was not there. It took me all morning to drive to the little town where Pablito and Nestor lived. I arrived around noon. Don Juan had taught me never to drive directly into the town so as not to arouse the curiosity of onlookers. Every time I had been there, I had always driven off the road, just before reaching the town, onto a flat field where youngsters usually played soccer. The dirt was well packed all the way to a walking trail, which was wide enough for a car, and which passed by Pablito's and Nestor's houses in the foothills south of town. As soon as I got to the edge of the field, I found that the walking trail had been turned into a gravel road. I deliberated whether to go to Nestor's house or Pablito's. The feeling that they were not there still persisted. I opted to go to Pablito's. I reasoned that Nestor lived alone while Pablito lived with his mother and his 4 sisters. If he was not there, then the women could help me find him. As I got closer to his house, I noticed that the path leading from the road up to the house had been widened. It looked as if the ground was hard, and since there was enough space for my car, I drove almost to the front door. A new porch with a tile roof had been added to the adobe house. There were no dogs barking, but I saw an enormous one sitting calmly behind a fenced area, alertly observing me. A flock of chickens that had been feeding in front of the house scattered around, cackling. I turned the motor off and stretched my arms over my head. My body was stiff. The house seemed deserted. The thought crossed my mind that perhaps Pablito and his family moved away and someone else was living there. Suddenly, the front door opened with a bang, and Pablito's mother stepped out as if someone had pushed her. She stared at me absent-mindedly for an instant. As I got out of my car, she seemed to recognize me. A graceful shiver ran through her body, and she ran toward me. I thought that she must have been napping and that the noise of the car had woken her. And when she came out to see what was going on, she did not know at first who I was. The incongruous sight of the old woman running towards me made me smile. When she got closer, I had a moment of doubt. Somehow, she moved so nimbly that she did not seem like Pablito's mother at all. "My goodness, what a surprise!" she exclaimed. "Doña Soledad?" I asked incredulously. "Don't you recognize me?" she replied, laughing. I made some stupid comments about her surprising agility. "Why do you always see me as a helpless old woman?" she asked, looking at me with an air of mock challenge. She bluntly accused me of having nicknamed her Mrs. Pyramid. I remembered that I had once said that to Nestor, that her shape reminded me of a pyramid. She had a very broad and massive behind and a small pointed head. The long dresses that she usually wore added to the effect. "Look at me," she said. "Do I still look like a pyramid?" She was smiling, but her eyes made me feel uncomfortable. I attempted to defend myself by making a joke, but she cut me off and coaxed me to admit that I was responsible for the nickname. I assured her that I had never intended it as such, and that anyway, at that moment, she was so lean that her shape was the furthest thing from a pyramid. "What's happened to you, Doña Soledad?" I asked. "You're transformed." "You said it," she replied briskly. "I've been transformed." I meant it figuratively. However, upon closer examination, I had to admit that there was no room for a metaphor. She was truly a changed person. I suddenly had a dry, metallic taste in my mouth. I was afraid. She placed her fists on her hips and stood with her legs slightly apart facing me. She was wearing a light green gathered skirt and a whitish blouse. Her skirt was shorter than those she used to wear. I could not see her hair. She had it tied with a thick band, a turban-like piece of cloth. She was barefoot, and she rhythmically tapped her big feet on the ground as she smiled with the candor of a young girl. I had never seen anyone exude as much strength as she did. I noticed a strange gleam in her eyes, a disturbing gleam, but not a frightening one. I thought that perhaps I had never really examined her appearance carefully. Among other things, I felt guilty for having glossed over many people during my years with Don Juan. The force of his personality had rendered everyone else pale and unimportant. I told her that I had never imagined that she could have such a stupendous vitality, that my carelessness was to blame for not really knowing her, and that no doubt I would have to meet everyone else all over again. She came closer to me. She smiled and put her right hand on the back of my left arm, grabbing it gently. "That's for sure," she whispered in my ear. Her smile froze and her eyes became glazed. She was so close to me that I felt her breast rubbing my left shoulder. My discomfort increased as I tried to convince myself that there was no reason for alarm. I repeated to myself over and over that I really had never known Pablito's mother, and that in spite of her odd behavior, she was probably being her normal self. But some frightened part of me knew that those were only bracing thoughts with no substance at all, because no matter how much I may have glossed over her person, not only did I remember her very well, but I had known her very well. She represented to me the archetype of a mother. I thought her to be in her late 50s or even older. Her weak muscles moved her bulky weight with extreme difficulty. Her hair had a lot of gray in it. She was, as I remembered her, a sad, somber woman with kind, handsome features, a dedicated, suffering mother, always in the kitchen, always tired. I also remembered to be a very gentle and unselfish woman, and a very timid one, timid to the point of being thoroughly subservient to anyone who happened to be around. That was the picture I had of her, reinforced throughout years of casual contact. That day, something was terribly different. The woman I was confronting did not at all fit the image I had of Pablito's mother, and yet she was the same person, leaner and stronger, looking 20 years younger than the last time I had seen her. I felt a shiver in my body. She moved a couple of steps in front of me and faced me. "Let me look at you," she said. "The Nagual told us that you're a devil." I remembered then that all of them, Pablito, his mother, his sisters, and Nestor, had always seemed unwilling to voice Don Juan's name and called him the Nagual, a usage which I myself adopted when talking with them. She daringly put her hands on my shoulders, something she had never done before. My body tensed. I really did not know what to say. There was a long pause that allowed me to take stock of myself. Her appearance and behavior had frightened me to the point that I had forgotten to ask about Pablito and Nestor. "Tell me, where is Pablito?" I asked her with a sudden wave of apprehension. "Oh, he's gone to the mountains," she responded in a non-committal tone and moved away from me. "And where is Nestor?" She rolled her eyes as if to show her indifference. "They are together in the mountains," she said in the same tone. I felt genuinely relieved and told her that I had known without the shadow of a doubt that they were all right. She glanced at me and smiled. A wave of happiness and ebullience came upon me, and I embraced her. She boldly returned the embrace and held me. That act was so outlandish that it took my breath away. Her body was rigid. I sensed an extraordinary strength in her. My heart began to pound. I gently tried to push her away as I asked her if Nestor was still seeing Don Gennaro and Don Juan. During our farewell meeting, Don Juan had expressed doubts that Nestor was ready to finish his apprenticeship. "Gennaro has left forever," she said, letting go of me. She fretted nervously with the edge of her blouse. "How about Don Juan?" "The Nahual is gone too," she said, puckering her lips. "Where did they go?" "You mean you don't know?" I told her that both of them had said goodbye to me 2 years before, and that all I knew was that they were leaving at that time. I had not really dared to speculate where they had gone. They had never told me their whereabouts in the past, and I had come to accept the fact that if they wanted to disappear from my life, all they had to do was to refuse to see me. "They're not around, that's for sure," she said, frowning. "And they won't be coming back, that's also for sure." Her voice was extremely unemotional. I began to feel annoyed with her. I wanted to leave. "But you're here," she said, changing her frown into a smile. "You must wait for Pablito and Nestor. They've been dying to see you." She held my arm firmly and pulled me away from my car. Compared to the way she had been in the past, her boldness was astounding. "But first, let me show you my friend," she said, and forcibly led me to the side of the house. There was a fenced area, like a small corral. A huge male dog was there. The first thing that attracted my attention was his healthy, lustrous, yellowish-brown fur. He did not seem to be a mean dog. He was chained, and the fence was not high enough to hold him. The dog remained impassive as we got closer to him, not even wagging his tail. Doña Soledad pointed to a good-sized cage in the back. A coyote was curled up inside. "That's my friend," she said. "The dog is not. He belongs to my girls." The dog looked at me and yawned. I liked him. I had a nonsensical feeling of kinship with him. "Come, let's go into the house," she said, pulling me by the arm. I hesitated. Some part of me was utterly alarmed and wanted to get out of there quickly, and yet another part of me would not have left for the world. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" she asked in an accusing tone. "I most certainly am," I exclaimed. She giggled, and in a most comforting tone she declared that she was a clumsy, primitive woman who was very awkward with words, and that she hardly knew how to treat people. She looked straight into my eyes and said that Don Juan had commissioned her to help me because he worried about me. "He told us that you're not serious and go around causing a lot of trouble to innocent people," she said. Up to that point, her assertions had been coherent to me, but I could not conceive Don Juan saying those things about me. We went inside the house. I wanted to sit down on the bench where Pablito and I usually sat. She stopped me. "This is not the place for you and me," she said. "Let's go to my room." "I'd rather sit here," I said firmly. "I know this spot and I feel comfortable on it." She clicked her lips in disapproval. She acted like a disappointed child. She contracted her upper lip until it looked like the flat beak of a duck. "There is something terribly wrong here," I said. "I think I'm going to leave if you don't tell me what's going on." She became very flustered and argued that her trouble was not knowing how to talk to me. I confronted her with an unmistakable transformation and demanded that she tell me what had happened. I had to know how such a change had come about. "If I tell you, will you stay?" she asked in a child's voice. "I'll have to." "In that case, I'll tell you everything, but it has to be in my room." I had a moment of panic. I made a supreme effort to calm myself, and we walked into her room. She lived in the back where Pablito had built a bedroom for her. I had once been in the room while it was being built and also after it was finished, just before she moved in. The room looked as empty as I had seen it before, except that there was a bed in the very center of it and two unobtrusive chests of drawers by the door. The whitewash of the walls had faded into a very soothing yellowish white. The wood of the ceiling had also weathered. Looking at the smooth, clean walls, I had the impression they were scrubbed daily with a sponge. The room looked more like a monastic cell, very frugal and aesthetic. There were no ornaments of any sort. The windows had thick, removable wood panels reinforced with an iron bar. There were no chairs or anything to sit on. Doña Soledad took my writing pad away from me, held it to her bosom, and then sat down on her bed, which was made up of two thick mattresses with no box springs. She indicated that I should sit down next to her. "You and I are the same," she said as she handed me my notebook. "I beg your pardon?" "You and I are the same," she repeated without looking at me. I could not figure out what she meant. She stared at me as if waiting for a response. "Just what is that supposed to mean, Doña Soledad?" I asked. My question seemed to baffle her. Obviously, she expected me to know what she meant. She laughed at first, but then when I insisted that I did not understand, she got angry. She sat up straight and accused me of being dishonest with her. Her eyes flared with rage. Her mouth contracted in a very ugly gesture of wrath that made her look extremely old. I honestly was at a loss and felt that no matter what I said, it would be wrong. She also seemed to be in the same predicament. Her mouth moved to say something, but her lips only quivered. At last, she muttered that it was not impeccable to act the way I did at such a serious moment. She turned her back to me. "Look at me, Doña Soledad," I said forcefully. "I'm not mystifying you in any sense. You must know something that I know nothing about." "You talk too much," she snapped angrily. "The Nahual told me never to let you talk. You twist everything." She jumped to her feet and stomped on the floor like a spoiled child. I became aware at that moment that the room had a different floor. I remembered it to be a dirt floor made from the dark soil of the area. The new floor was reddish pink. I momentarily put off a confrontation with her and walked around the room. I could not imagine how I could have missed noticing the floor when I first entered. It was magnificent. At first I thought that it was red clay that had been laid like cement when it was soft and moist, but then I saw that there were no cracks in it. Clay would have dried, curled up, cracked, and clumps would have formed. I bent down and gently ran my fingers over it. It was as hard as bricks. The clay had been fired. I became aware then that the floor was made of very large flat slabs of clay put together over a bed of soft clay that served as a matrix. The slabs made a most intricate and fascinating design, but a thoroughly unobtrusive one, unless one paid deliberate attention to it. The skill with which the slabs had been placed in position indicated to me a very well-conceived plan. I wanted to know how such big slabs had been fired without being warped. I turned around to ask Doña Soledad. I quickly desisted. She would not have known what I was talking about. I paced over the floor again. The clay was a bit rough, almost like sandstone. It made a perfect slide-proof surface. "Did Pablito put down this floor?" I asked. She did not answer. "It's a superb piece of work," I said. "You should be very proud of him." I had no doubt that Pablito had done it. No one else could have had the imagination and the capacity to conceive of it. I figured that he must have made it during the time I had been away. But on second thought, I realized that I had never entered Doña Soledad's room since it had been built 6 or 7 years before. "Pablito, Pablito, bah!" she exclaimed in an angry, raspy voice. "What makes you think he's the only one who can make things?" We exchanged a long, sustained look. And all of a sudden, I knew that it was she who had made the floor, and that Don Juan had put her up to it. We stood quietly, looking at each other for some time. I felt it would have been thoroughly superfluous to ask if I was correct. "I made it myself," she finally said in a dry tone. "The Nahual told me how." Her statements made me feel euphoric. I practically lifted her up in an embrace. I twirled her around. All I could think to do was to bombard her with questions. I wanted to know how she had made the slabs, what the designs represented, where she got the clay. But she did not share my exhilaration. She remained quiet and impassive, looking at me askance from time to time. I paced on the floor again. The bed had been placed at the very epicenter of some converging lines. The clay slabs had been cut in sharp angles to create converging motifs that seemed to radiate out from under the bed. "I have no words to tell you how impressed I am," I said. "Words? Who needs words?" she said cuttingly. I had a flash of insight. My reason had been betraying me. There was only one possible way of explaining her magnificent metamorphosis. Don Juan must have made her his apprentice. How else could an old woman like Doña Soledad turn into such a weird, powerful being? That should have been obvious to me from the moment I laid eyes on her, but my set of expectations about her had not included that possibility. I deduced that whatever Don Juan had done to her must have taken place during the 2 years I had not seen her, although 2 years seemed hardly any time at all for such a superb alteration. "I think I now know what happened to you," I said in a casual and cheerful tone. "Something has cleared up in my mind right now." "Oh, is that so?" she said, thoroughly uninterested. "The Nahual is teaching you to become a sorceress. Isn't that true?" She glared at me defiantly. I felt that I had said the worst possible thing. There was an expression of true contempt on her face. She was not going to tell me anything. "What a bastard you are!" she exclaimed suddenly, shaking with rage. I thought that her anger was unjustified. I sat down on one end of the bed while she nervously tapped on the floor with her heel. Then she sat down on the other end without looking at me. "What exactly do you want me to do?" I asked in a firm and intimidating tone. "I told you already," she said in a yell. "You and I are the same." I asked her to explain her meaning and not to assume for one instant that I knew anything. Those statements angered her even more. She stood up abruptly and dropped her skirt to the ground. "This is what I mean," she yelled, caressing her pubic area. My mouth opened involuntarily. I became aware that I was staring at her like an idiot. "You and I are one here," she said. I was dumbfounded. Doña Soledad, the old Indian woman, mother of my friend Pablito, was actually half naked a few feet away from me, showing me her genitals. I stared at her, incapable of formulating any thoughts. The only thing I knew was that her body was not the body of an old woman. She had beautifully muscular thighs, dark and hairless. The bone structure of her hips was broad, but there was no fat on them. She must have noticed my scrutiny and flung herself on the bed. "You know what to do," she said, pointing to her pubis. "We are one here." She uncovered her robust breasts. "Doña Soledad, I implore you," I exclaimed. "What's come over you? You're Pablito's mother." "No, I'm not," she snapped. "I'm no one's mother." She sat up and looked at me with fierce eyes. "I am just like you, a piece of the nagual," she said. "We're made to mix." She opened her legs, and I jumped away. "Wait a minute, Doña Soledad," I said. "Let's talk for a while." I had a moment of wild fear, and a sudden crazy thought occurred to me. Would it be possible, I asked myself, that Don Juan was hiding somewhere around there laughing his head off? "Don Juan!" I bellowed. My yell was so loud and profound that Doña Soledad jumped off her bed and covered herself hurriedly with her skirt. I saw her putting it on as I bellowed again, "Don Juan!" I ran through the house bellowing Don Juan's name until my throat was sore. Doña Soledad, in the meantime, had run outside the house and was standing by my car, looking puzzled at me. I walked over to her and asked her if Don Juan had told her to do all that. She nodded affirmatively. I asked if he was around. She said no. "Tell me everything," I said. She told me that she was merely following Don Juan's orders. He had commanded her to change her being into a warrior's in order to help me. She declared that she had been waiting for years to fulfill that promise. "I'm very strong now," she said softly, "just for you. But you disliked me in my room, didn't you?" I found myself explaining that I did not dislike her, that what counted were my feelings for Pablito. And then I realized that I did not have the vaguest idea of what I was saying. Doña Soledad seemed to understand my embarrassing position, and so that our mishap had to be forgotten. "You must be famished," she said vivaciously. "I'll make you some food." "There's a lot that you haven't explained to me," I said. "I'll be frank with you. I wouldn't stay here for anything in the world. You frighten me." "You are obligated to accept my hospitality, if it is only for a cup of coffee," she said, unruffled. "Come, let's forget what happened." She made a gesture of going into the house. At that moment, I heard a deep growl. The dog was standing, looking at us, as if he understood what was being said. Doña Soledad fixed a most frightening gaze on me. Then she softened it and smiled. "Don't let my eyes bother you," she said. "The truth is that I am old. Lately, I've been getting dizzy. I think I need glasses." She broke into a laugh and clowned, looking through cupped fingers as if they were glasses. "An old Indian woman with glasses. That'll be a laugh," she said, giggling. I made up my mind then to be rude and get out of there, without any explanation. But before I drove away, I wanted to leave some things for Pablito and his sisters. I opened the trunk of my car to get the gifts I had brought for them. I leaned way into it to reach first for the 2 packages that were lodged against the wall of the back seat, behind the spare tire. I got hold of one and was about to grab the other when I felt a soft, furry hand on the nape of my neck. I shrieked involuntarily and hit my head on the open lid. I turned to look. The pressure of the furry hand did not let me turn completely, but I was able to catch a fleeting glimpse of a silvery arm or paw hovering over my neck. I wriggled in panic and pushed myself away from the trunk and fell down on my seat with the packages still in my hand. My whole body shook. The muscles of my legs contracted and I found myself leaping up and running away. "I didn't mean to frighten you," Doña Soledad said apologetically as I watched her from 10 feet away. She showed me the palms of her hands in a gesture of surrender, as if assuring me that what I had felt was not her hand. "What did you do to me?" I asked, trying to sound calm and detached. She seemed to be either thoroughly embarrassed or baffled. She muttered something and shook her head as though she could not say it, or did not know what I was talking about. "Come on, Doña Soledad," I said, coming closer to her. "Don't play tricks on me." She seemed about to weep. I wanted to comfort her, but some part of me resisted. After a moment's pause, I told her what I had felt and seen. "That's just terrible," she said in a shrieking voice. In a very childlike gesture, she covered her face with her right forearm. I thought she was crying. I came over to her and tried to put my arm around her shoulders. I could not bring myself to do it. "Come on now, Doña Soledad," I said. Let's forget all this and let me give you these packages before I leave. I stepped in front of her